Welcome to this deep dive, and today we're diving into the South China Sea dispute. And wow, you guys sent us a ton of material on this. Articles, videos. It seems like you're really ready to get past just the headlines and understand why this religion is considered such a global flashpoint.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, you've got these seemingly insignificant little islands and reefs causing all this tension that could really impact all of us. We're not just talking about regional power plays here, but global trade, access to vital resources, even things like the price of goods on our shelves.
Yeah, it really does feel like a lot hinges on who controls these tiny little pieces of land. So could you break down for us what's at stake here and why everyone's so invested?
Absolutely. Let's start with the sheer volume of trade that flows through the South China Sea.
Okay.
A third of global maritime traffic. Everything from oil and natural gas to the clothes we wear, the electronics we use, all pass through these waters, disrupt that flow, and the impact on the global economy would be enormous.
Huge. And then there's the natural resources that are under the seabed, right? We're talking billions of barrels of oil, trillions of cubic feet of natural gas. Not to mention a fishing ground that provides something like 12.5% of the global catch.
Right.
Sovereignty over these waters basically means controlling a treasure trove of resources.
Absolutely. And it's easy to see why countries are fiercely protective of their claims, especially China, which has staked out a vast area with its 9-dash line, right? Claiming historical dominion over something like 90% of the sea.
90%? That's a big chunk.
It is. And they point to these ancient texts and maps, some dating back to the Han Dynasty, around the year 0, as evidence of their long-standing presence in the region.
So basically they're saying we were here first, so that's ours.
Essentially, yes. But it's a claim that's fraught with complexities. For one thing, those ancient texts are open to interpretation. Did they really signify sovereignty over the entire South China Sea, or just that Chinese vessels sailed through the area? It's a question that has fueled debate among historians and legal scholars for decades.
And then there's UNCLOS, right? The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which sets pretty clear guidelines for maritime boundaries. Doesn't China's 9-dash line directly contradict those international rules?
It does, and that's a major point of contention. China has ratified UNCLOS, but they tend to interpret certain aspects of the treaty in a way that supports their expansive claims.
So it's not just about playing by the rules, but how you interpret those rules.
Exactly.
And of course, we can't forget the United States in all of this. They haven't even ratified UNCLOS themselves, yet they're conducting these freedom of navigation operations in the disputed waters, sailing warships right through areas claimed by China.
Right. It's a strategic move designed to challenge China's claims. Show that they are committed to keeping those shipping lanes open for international use. It's a complex situation, to say the least.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to understand this historical context and the conflicting interpretations of international law to grasp the depth of the tensions here.
Yeah, it's like a multi-layered chess game, with each player making these calculated moves, trying to anticipate the other's next step. Speaking of moves, things haven't always remained purely diplomatic, have they? There have been some pretty tense incidents at sea that suggest this could boil over at any moment.
Absolutely. There's a long history of confrontations in the South China Sea. One that comes to mind is the 2014 standoff between China and Vietnam near the Paracel Islands. China moved an oil rig into waters claimed by Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
And it led to a tense naval standoff with ships from both countries basically jostling for position.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
And then just this year, we saw the Chinese Coast Guard firing water cannons at Philippine ships that were just trying to resupply a military outpost on Second Thomas Shoal. It's a stark reminder of how quickly things can escalate in this volatile region.
Yeah, and the Philippines have actually maintained a presence on that shoal for decades.
Oh, really?
Using a grounded World War II-era ship, the BRP Sierra Madre, as makeshift base.
Wow, what a...
Yeah, imagine the tension.
I can't even imagine.
On board that vessel, constantly facing off against the Chinese Coast Guard. It's a powder keg situation.
Yeah.
It really is.
It's fascinating how something as simple as a shoal or a rusty old ship becomes this focal point in this much larger power struggle. It's almost like a microcosm of the entire South China Sea dispute, with each side determined not to yield an inch.
You got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is a potent symbol, and it kind of brings us to another crucial aspect of this whole South China Sea dispute, and that's the historical claims that underpin China's, assertive stance. You mentioned the nine-dash line before, which China uses to basically, demarcate its expansive territorial claim. But where did that line even come from, and how is it rooted in history?
Yeah, it seems like they're reaching pretty far back in time to justify what they're doing now.
Yeah.
What are some of the specific historical arguments they're making?
Well, China points to, centuries of maritime activity in the South China Sea. They reference ancient texts like the Yuji-tu, a map from the Han Dynasty, which actually describes islets, sand keys, reefs, and banks in the South China Sea. And they argue that these texts demonstrate their historical presence and control over these waters.
But some historians argue that just sailing through an area or fishing there doesn't necessarily mean you own it, right? How does China respond to that?
Well, China contends that their historical presence wasn't merely about passing through, but about active governance and administration. They point to evidence of fishing fleets operating under official licenses, naval patrols protecting trade routes, even things like the collection of taxes from those operating within these waters. And they argue that this demonstrates a sustained and deliberate exercise of authority over the South China Sea for centuries.
It's not just about being there, it's about actually controlling and managing the area.
Yeah.
But even if we accept that argument, how do they reconcile those historical claims with, modern international law, specifically UNCS?
Right, that's the key question. China argues that UNCS acknowledges the concept of historic rights, which allows states to maintain certain traditional uses of maritime areas, even if those uses might exceed the limits set by modern maritime boundaries.
Okay.
So they believe their historical claim grants them special rights to resources within the nine-dash line, regardless of what UNCS might stipulate about exclusive economic zones or territorial seas.
But that's where the international community really pushes back, though, right? Those countries don't recognize those historic rights as superseding UNCLOS, which is meant to provide a clear framework for maritime claims.
Exactly. And that creates this fundamental tension at the heart of this dispute.
Yeah.
China sees the South China Sea through the lens of its long history, believing it's reclaiming what rightfully belongs to them. Other nations view it through the lens of international law, arguing that China is exceeding its legal rights and basically undermining the established global order.
And it's not just about legal arguments and historical interpretations either, is it? There's this powerful undercurrent of national pride and historical grievance fueling China's actions, right? They often talk about the century of humiliation, that period, from the mid-19th to mid-20th century when China was weakened and really exploited by foreign powers.
That's a crucial point. For China, the South China Sea is about more than just resources or territory. It's about erasing the memory of that era of weakness and reclaiming their rightful place, as a great power. Asserting control over the South China Sea is seen as a way to restore national pride and demonstrate their resurgence on the global stage.
It's almost as if they're saying, we were once humiliated and exploited, but we're back now, and we're not going to let anyone push us around again. And that makes it even harder to find a diplomatic solution, right? Because it's not just about legal arguments anymore. It's about deeply held beliefs and national identity.
Precisely. And it's not just China feeling the pressure of history either, right? Other nations in the region, like Vietnam and the Philippines, have their own historical narratives and grievances. They, too, have experienced colonization and exploitation and are determined to protect their own sovereignty and resources.
So we've got this really complex interplay of historical claims, legal interpretations, economic interests, and national pride, all kind of converging in this one strategically vital waterway. No wonder it's considered such a potential flashpoint. But let's maybe shift gears a bit and talk about the role of the United States in this whole equation. They're not a claimant to the South China Sea, but they're certainly not a neutral observer.
Right. The U.S. position is interesting because it hinges on this commitment to upholding international law, specifically the principle of freedom of navigation. They argue that China's actions in the South China Sea threaten the free flow of commerce and pose a challenge to the rules-based international order.
And they're backing up those words with actions, right? We talked about those freedom of navigation operations where U.S. warships actually sail through areas claimed by China, asserting their right to navigate those waters without restriction.
Yeah, those operations are a very deliberate signal to China that the U.S. doesn't recognize their expansive claims and won't allow them to unilaterally dictate who can and cannot sail through the South China Sea. They're also meant to reassure U.S. allies in the region, like the Philippines and Japan, that the U.S. is committed to their security and won't abandon them to, Chinese pressure.
But those actions also risk escalating tensions, don't they? I mean, China sees those operations as provocative intrusions into their sovereign territory, and they often respond with their own shows of force, so it's a delicate balancing act.
It is. The U.S. wants to uphold international law and support its allies, but they also don't want to stumble into a direct confrontation with China. It's a high-stakes game of geopolitical chess, with each move carefully calculated to advance their interests without, triggering a wider conflict. And it's all playing out against a backdrop of increasing military buildup on both sides.
Yeah.
China is rapidly modernizing its navy, expanding its presence in the South China Sea, constructing artificial islands to solidify its control. The U.S. is responding by bolstering its military alliances in the region, deploying more advanced warships, conducting more frequent military exercises.
It seems like a recipe for disaster. With so much military hardware concentrated in such a small area, the risk of miscalculation or unintended escalation is, enormous. One small incident, a near collision at sea, a disputed fishing ground, any of these could spark a chain reaction that quickly spirals out of control.
That's the fear, isn't it? And it highlights the critical need for clear communication, confidence-building measures, and a robust framework for managing incidents at sea. Without those safeguards, the South China Sea could easily become the tinderbox that ignites a major international conflict.
So we've got this volatile mix of historical claims, competing national interests, escalating military tensions, and just a lack of trust between the key players. It's a complex and potentially explosive situation, but it's one that demands our attention. Because the outcome of this dispute will have far-reaching consequences, not just for the countries directly involved, but for the whole world.
Yeah, it really is. It makes you wonder how much of this tension is fueled by perception and the way this dispute is portrayed by the different players.
Oh, that's a critical point. The narrative surrounding the South China Sea is often shaped by, national interests and domestic audiences. Each country involved has its own version of events, right? Highlighting their claims and kind of casting the other side as the aggressor.
So it's like a public relations battle playing out alongside the military and diplomatic maneuvers.
Yeah, you could say that. Information warfare, some call it.
How does that impact the situation, on the ground? Well, it can make it even harder to find common ground. For example, Chinese state-controlled media often portrays China as, a victim of historical injustice, defending its rightful territory against encroaching foreign powers.
Right.
This narrative really resonates with the Chinese public that's, increasingly nationalistic and wary of Western influence.
So it reinforces this idea that China is simply righting past wrongs and standing up for its legitimate interests, even if those actions seem aggressive to outsiders.
Exactly.
And on the other side, you have countries like the Philippines and Vietnam who use their own media outlets and international platforms to highlight what they see as Chinese bullying and disregard for international law.
Right. They portray China as this regional hegemon bent on dominating the South China Sea and pushing its smaller neighbors around. And, this narrative helps rally international support for their cause and puts pressure on China to moderate its behavior.
It's a fascinating but also concerning dynamic.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about who has the strongest military or the most compelling legal arguments, right? It's also about who can effectively control the narrative and shape international perceptions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's where things get really tricky because the South China Sea dispute is incredibly complex with all these layers of history, law, geopolitics, all interwoven. Simplifying it into, good guys and bad guys, victims and aggressors, doesn't really do justice to the nuances of the situation.
I got it.
Yeah. It's a reminder that we need to be critical consumers of information, especially when it comes to something as potentially volatile as this. We can't just accept the narratives presented to us at face value. We need to dig deeper, consider multiple perspectives, and try to understand the motivations and interests of all the players involved.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that's precisely what makes these deep dives so valuable.
Yeah.
They allow us to peel back the layers of complexity, to move beyond those headlines and sound bites, and to develop, a more nuanced understanding of the forces shaping our world.
It's about equipping ourselves with the knowledge and critical thinking skills to navigate a world where information is both abundant and, let's face it, easily manipulated.
For sure.
Because at the end of the day, Informed citizens are essential for finding peaceful and sustainable solutions to these complex global challenges like the South China Sea dispute.
I completely agree. Understanding the intricacies of these issues, the historical context, the competing claims, the potential flashpoints, it's all crucial if we want to avoid stumbling blindly into conflict.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today, from historical claims and legal interpretations to military posturing and information warfare. We've really explored the multifaceted nature of this dispute and why it matters so much to the world.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey, tracing the threads of history, geopolitics, national pride, all of which have become so tightly intertwined in the South China Sea. And while the future remains uncertain, one thing is clear. This region will continue to be a focal point of global attention and a potential flashpoint for years to come.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you would leave our listener with? What's the one thing they should keep in mind as they continue to follow this unfolding story?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the South China Sea dispute is not a simple story with easy answers. It's a complex web of competing interests, historical grievances, and national aspirations. And finding a peaceful and sustainable solution will require a commitment to dialogue, diplomacy, and a willingness to see things from, multiple perspectives.
Those are wise words to end on. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into the South China Sea. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and a deeper understanding of this really crucial global issue. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper.